Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this demo lesson, Implement Azure Firewall Rules. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to get some experience actually implementing Azure Firewall Rules in the Azure Cloud Sandbox. We're going to start off by going over a case study scenario so that we can get familiar with what we are going to see whenever we set up this demonstration, as well as get a better understanding architecturally of what solution it is that Azure Firewall provides and what it might look like as an engineer when deciding to implement Azure Firewall. Then we're going to go through the demonstration steps that we will follow in our demo in the Azure Cloud Sandbox, and then we're going to bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. So without further ado, let's get into talking about our Control-Alt-Suites environment setup and case study scenario. For our Control-Alt-Suites organization in the Azure Cloud Sandbox, we're going to have a hub VNet. And inside of this hub VNet, we're going to have a hub subnet with a virtual machine. And then we're going to have an Azure Firewall subnet with our Azure Firewall resource. And this is a classically implemented Azure Firewall that's going to be part of our demo setup, because we're not going to focus on actually creating the firewall resource, because we've done that in a previous lesson. And in this lesson, we're going to focus on the Azure Firewall rules themselves. Then off to the side, we're going to have a spoke VNet. And this spoke VNet is also going to have a virtual machine resource. Now, this is going to be peered with our hub VNet. So these two networks will be able to communicate over this peering connection that we have here. But we are specifically going to be focusing on the hub VNet for our demonstration purposes. And I've just included this spoke VNet off to the side for you to play around with to get more experience should you choose to do so. Now, on our hub VNet, what we're going to be doing is creating a route table, and then we're going to make a route to route all traffic back to our Azure Firewall resource, and we're going to associate it with our hub subnet so that all traffic from this virtual machine will be routed through our Azure Firewall. And then we're going to be having those rules, and those rules will take effect on that virtual machine because traffic is being routed to the firewall. Now, additionally, you can add a route table to the spoke VNet to do something similar to show how you can also control traffic across VNets in peered virtual network use cases. Now that we know the case study scenario, let's talk about our demonstration steps here. Again, we have our firewall resource inside of our hub VNet, and we're going to go through the process of actually implementing the firewall rules. Again, these are classically implemented firewall rules. So we're going to create these on the firewall resource. We'll create our DNAT rules, our network rules, and our application rules all within their own rule collections. And then again, these will be on the firewall resource themselves as classically implemented rules. And then we're going to evaluate those rules and how they affect our traffic for any subnets where a route is associated sending that traffic to the firewall. Again, the setup is available in the resources of this lesson. That's everything for now on our demonstration steps. Let's make our way to the Azure Cloud Sandbox and get started. All right, gurus, here we are inside of the Azure Cloud Sandbox. We authenticated using the credentials provided to us by the website to get authenticated into the Azure Cloud Sandbox. And as you'll notice here, I have a storage account already created. Whenever I configured my Cloud Shell instance is when I created this storage account. So go through the process of setting up your Cloud Shell instance, make sure you're in a PowerShell environment, and then go to the resources of this video lesson where you're going to find the demo setup file, copy all of the contents of this file over, come back to the Cloud Shell instance, paste it in, and what this is going to be used to do is set up our demo environment. Now, for this one, we're going to need to authenticate into our virtual machines. So it's going to ask you to provide an admin username. For doing so, we're going to provide our admin username. You can use Cloud Chase or whatever username you'd like, and then hit enter. And then it's going to ask you to provide your password as a secure string. Now I'm going to type in my password here, and you can use whatever password you'd like to use. Once you've done that, hit enter, and it's going to go off and start running this deployment to create and set up our environment. So we're going to skip ahead to when that is complete using some movie magic. All right, gurus, so we're back and our template has finished deploying here. So we'll minimize our Cloud Shell. And if you hit refresh, what you'll see is all the resources that we've now created using this template. Again, we have our hub VNet with a hub VM in it. We have our spoke VNet with a spoke VM inside of it. We have our firewall. And the very first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to create that route table so that we have a route sending traffic from our hub subnet in our hub VNet to our firewall. So if we come to our hub VNet here, what we'll see is we have our hub subnet and it's 10.60.0.0/24. So you can copy that or just keep mind of it, because now we're going to use that to create a route. And then we'll go real fast and we'll get the private IP of our firewall before we create that route. And again, you can copy this to the clipboard, save it somewhere, or just keep it in memory. And then once you've got those two things, we're ready to create our route. We'll type in route tables into the search bar. We'll select it under services and we'll click create here. And this will bring us into configuring our route table. We're going to make sure that this route table exists inside of the same region as our resources were deployed. It's going to be Central US in my case. Select my resource group. I'm going to call this my route table 01. Click review and create. It's going to validate the deployment. Once it does, I'll click create, and it's going to create this route table for me where we're going to create our route from our hub subnet to our Azure Firewall. So now that it's finished, we'll go to the resource here. And then on the blade here, under settings, we'll click on routes. We'll click add a route. We're going to call this our firewall route, an address prefix here. And we're going to specify an IP address and the source IP address. We're going to use 0.0.0.0/0. And then the next hop is going to be virtual appliance. And we're going to send it to the firewall 10.60.2.4. And this is going to send all traffic to this firewall here. That's what the route is going to be. We'll click add. It's going to add this route for us. We're going to go to our subnets and we're going to add an association, select our hub VNet, our hub subnet, and click OK. And it's going to save this route table and associate it to this hub subnet here. Now we'll go back to our home. We'll go to our resource group. We'll go to our firewall resource. And here we have a classically implemented firewall. We'll go to rules, under settings, and here's where we can configure our rules. We have our NAT rules, network rules, and our application rules. We're going to start off with our NAT rules here by clicking add NAT rule collection. And this is the rule that we're going to use to allow SSH traffic into our networks. And we're going to do this using network address translation in this NAT rule. It's going to take that public traffic destined for the public IP of our Azure Firewall resource, and it's going to convert it into private traffic on the back end, performing that translation. And this makes sure that we're not exchanging private IP address information with the client. So we can call this our NAT collection here, because this is going to be a collection of NAT rules. We can specify our priority between 100 and 65,000. We're going to do 200 here. And again, the action here is that this is a DNAT rule. We're going to call our rule here, allow SSH. Protocol is going to be TCP. We can choose between TCP and UDP. We can choose between an IP address and an IP group. IP group being a collection of IP addresses that we've created and configured for that IP group. We'll select the IP address. The source, we're going to use a wildcard here representing anything that might reach out. And the destination address is actually going to be the public IP of the firewall resource. So we'll go get that by coming up to our browser tab, right click, select duplicate, and once it opens up this new tab, we're going to go back to our home, go to our firewall resource, and we're going to go to its public IP. We'll copy that to the clipboard, bring it back to the other tab, and we'll paste that into the destination address here. The destination port 22, and the translated address is going to be the private IP of the virtual machine that we're trying to connect to. And in this case, for this deployment, I know it's going to be 10.60.0.4. And the translated port port 22. We'll click add, and this is going to add that NAT collection here. Now this will take just a couple of minutes, so we'll skip ahead to when this is done. All right, gurus, so we're back and our NAT rule has finished adding, and we see it here under our NAT collection that we just created. And something worthy of mention here is that when a DNAT rule is matched, an implicit corresponding network rule is created to allow that translated traffic. And so basically, once it comes in as public traffic and is natted to private traffic, an implicit network rule is added to allow that traffic within our network. And this is something that goes on in the background. We don't really have control over it. We just create the NAT rules and this happens for us implicitly. Now that we've covered that, let's talk about network rule collections here. We'll select it and we'll click add network rule collection to add our first net rule collection here. We'll actually call it net collection. And then we'll specify our priority, again, 100 to 65,000. We'll specify 200 here, and this can be the same priority as the NAT collection because it's a different rule type entirely. We can specify our action of allow or deny. I'll choose allow here, and we can create rules using IP addresses, service tags, and FQDNs here. We're going to use IP address here, and we're going to make this one our Google DNS. Then we'll specify our protocol here. We're going to use UDP because we're going to use this for DNS here. We might want to, with network rules on Azure Firewall, allow traffic to our DNS servers. If we have a domain controller out there and we want to allow things to be able to reach it for DNS, well, we would create a rule like this. And instead of the Google DNS, it would be the domain controllers themselves. And so for our source type, we can specify again IP address or IP group. We'll specify a source of anything inside of our subnet. So 10.60.0.0/24. And then an IP address destination of anything trying to get out to 8.8.8. And then the destination port is going to be 53. And we'll click add. And this is going to go off and create that network rule collection for us. So we'll be back once that's done. All right, gurus, so we're back and we see our network rule collection has been created here. And we'll move into our final rule type here, application rules. For our application rule collection, we'll add it in. We'll call this our app collection, following our theme of naming our other collections. We'll specify our priority here of 200. Our action can be allow or deny. And with these rules for application rules, we can use FQDN tags, or we can use target FQDNs. And in our case, we're going to use a target FQDN here. We're going to call this our Microsoft com. And then the source type here is going to be IP address, and it's going to be anything coming from our subnet. So 10.60.0.0/24. And the port protocol we're going to specify here are those for HTTP and HTTPS. We're going to specify a target FQDN of www.microsoft.com. We could use a wildcard instead of www, and that would allow us to get any of the subdomains off of Microsoft.com, but we're going to stick with this. We'll click add here. And at this time, I think it's a good spot for us to split this lesson into a part 2 and follow back up on these rules to check and validate whether or not they're working. So let's go ahead and conclude for now and make our way into part 2 of this lesson.